Marcus was living an ordinary life, the kind of life many people could relate to. He was a simple, hard-working man who woke up early every morning, put on his clean shirt, grabbed a quick breakfast, and left for work. He lived in a quiet neighborhood, where people knew each other by name, and most days passed without anything unusual happening. That day, too, started off in the same way. Marcus had just finished a long shift at work, and all he wanted was to get home, rest his tired body, and eat dinner with his family. The sun was setting as he drove his car down a familiar road. The warm orange light filled the streets, making everything look peaceful and calm. Marcus rolled down the window slightly to let in the evening breeze, enjoying a rare moment of peace after a stressful day. He hummed softly to the music playing. On the radio, his thoughts drifting to his kids who would be waiting at the dinner table. In his mind, the day was almost over, and soon he would be surrounded by the comfort of home. But life often changes in the blink of an eye, and Marcus's peaceful drive was about to take an unexpected turn. In the rearview mirror, he suddenly noticed flashing red and blue lights. His heart skipped a beat. At first, he thought maybe the police car was trying to get past him on its way to another emergency. He pulled slightly to the side, expecting it to speed by, but the light stayed behind him, and then the siren blared. The sound pierced the calm of the evening, and Marcus realized the officers wanted him to stop. Confused, he slowed down and parked carefully at the edge of the road. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he took a deep breath. He had no idea why he was being stopped. His car was in good condition, his license was valid, and he hadn't been speeding. Everything about the situation felt strange, but Marcus tried to remain calm. He remembered the advice his parents once gave him. Always stay respectful with the police, keep your hands visible, and don't argue. As the police car pulled up behind him, Marcus could see the officers through his mirror. Two men stepped out, their expressions hard and serious. They walked toward his car with the kind of energy that made Marcus uneasy. He lowered his window and waited, his heart thumping louder with each step they took. When the first officer reached him, he leaned down and asked for Marcus's license and registration. His voice wasn't polite, it was sharp and commanding. Marcus nodded quickly and handed over the documents. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked carefully, trying to keep his tone respectful. But instead of explaining, the officer just studied him with narrowed eyes, as if searching for a reason not to believe him. The second officer stood a few steps back, one hand resting near his holster as if ready for trouble. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. He had done nothing wrong, yet the way they looked at him made him feel guilty, like he had already been judged before saying a word. Inside, Marcus's mind raced. He thought about his family and how they would be worried if he was late, he thought. About his kids waiting with their homework and stories from school. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was just a man driving home after work, tired and hungry. Why was this happening to him? As the officer glanced at his license, Marcus could see suspicion in his eyes. It didn't make sense. The car was his, the papers were clean, and yet the atmosphere grew heavier by the second. Something in Marcus's gut told him that this stop wasn't about traffic rules. It was about something else, something unfair. The sound of crickets filled the silence around them as cars drove by slowly, some drivers glancing curiously at the scene. Marcus sat still, hands on the wheel, breathing carefully as though every movement might be misinterpreted. The evening that had begun so peacefully was no longer ordinary. It had shifted into something tense, something dangerous, and Marcus knew deep down that this was only the beginning of a long, difficult night. Marcus sat stiffly in his seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel as the officer stared at his driver's license longer than necessary. The silence was heavy, almost unbearable. He could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears, pounding like a drum. Something felt wrong. He wasn't being treated like an ordinary driver who had been pulled over for a minor traffic issue. There was no explanation, no simple "you were speeding" or "your taillight is out." Instead, he was met with silence and suspicion. The first officer finally handed the license back. But instead of letting Marcus go, he leaned closer to the window. His voice was sharp, cutting through the evening air. "Step out of the car." Marcus blinked in confusion. "Sir, may I ask what this is about? Did I do something wrong?" His voice was calm, but edged with unease. "Don't question me," the officer snapped. "I said step out of the car now." The second officer moved closer, his eyes locked on Marcus like a hawk watching prey. His hand rested on his holster again, fingers twitching slightly, a silent warning that things could escalate. Marcus swallowed hard. Every instinct told him to comply, but another part of him screamed that this wasn't fair. He had rights, didn't he? He hadn't broken any laws, but in that moment, the fear of what might happen if he refused outweighed everything else. Slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the car door. As Marcus stepped out, the evening air felt colder, sharper, as though the world itself had turned against him. He stood tall, trying to maintain his dignity, but his chest tightened with anxiety. Cars passed by on the other side of the street, some drivers slowing down to look. He wondered if anyone would stop, if anyone would record what was happening. Hands on the hood, the officer ordered. Marcus froze. "Sir, I really don't understand." I said, "Hands on the hood." The officer barked louder this time, his voice full of authority. Leaving no room for argument, Marcus complied, placing his palms flat against the cool metal of his car's hood. He could feel the heat of the engine fading beneath his skin. The position was humiliating. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't dangerous. Yet here he was, being treated like he was guilty of something he didn't even know about. The first officer began patting him down roughly, searching his pockets. Every movement was quick, harsh, and unkind. Marcus clenched his jaw, holding back his frustration. He wanted to shout, to demand an explanation. But he knew that anger could make things worse. The second officer circled the car, shining his flashlight inside, even though it was still early evening and there was no reason to. He checked the back seat, the floor, even the glove compartment, muttering under his breath as though he was determined to find anything that would justify what they were doing. Marcus felt a deep anger rising within him. He had lived his whole life respecting the law, teaching his children to trust authority, and believing that justice mattered. Yet here he was, standing on the side of the road, hands pressed against his own car, treated like a criminal without cause. Nothing? The second officer finally said, stepping back from the car. The first officer, still unsatisfied, looked Marcus in the eye. "Where are you coming from?" "Work," Marcus answered, trying to keep his tone steady. "And where exactly is that?" Marcus explained, giving details, but the officer's expression didn't soften. Instead, he smirked slightly, as if Marcus's answer confirmed his doubts rather than erased them. "Yeah, you fit the description," the officer said finally. Marcus frowned. "Description of what? Of who?" "Of someone we're looking for," the officer replied vaguely, offering no real explanation. Marcus felt his stomach twist. He had heard those words before in stories, in news reports. "You fit the description." It was a phrase that too often meant innocent men like him were stopped, searched, and humiliated simply because of the color of their skin. The second officer spoke up, his voice low but firm. "We should take him in." Marcus's chest tightened. "Take me in? For what? I haven't done anything." His voice cracked slightly, a mixture of fear and disbelief. The first officer didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out his handcuffs. The metallic click as they opened echoed through the quiet street like a cruel warning. In that moment, Marcus's world seemed to crumble. He thought about his family waiting at home, his children sitting by the window expecting him to walk through the door any minute. He thought about the shame of being taken away in handcuffs in front of strangers, of being treated like a criminal for no reason. "This is a mistake," Marcus said firmly, his voice shaking but still strong. "Haven't done anything wrong." The officer grabbed his wrist and twisted it behind his back, snapping the cuff on with a cold finality. "Tell it to the judge," he muttered. The metal dug into Marcus's skin, the weight of injustice pressing heavier than the cuffs themselves. He wanted to fight back, to resist, but he knew that could end badly. Too many stories had ended with tragedy. So he bit down his anger and allowed himself to be restrained, his dignity slipping away with every second. By now, a small crowd had begun to gather. A few people pulled out their phones, recording the scene. Their voices whispered in shock, in disbelief. Marcus could hear them, but their presence offered little comfort. He was still alone in this fight. As the officers pushed him toward the squad car, Marcus's eyes scanned the crowd, hoping someone would speak up. Someone would say the words he couldn't, but no one stepped forward. The bystanders only watched, their phones raised like silent witnesses. The door of the police car opened with a creak. Marcus was guided inside, his head ducked low as if he were something to be hidden, something to be ashamed of. The door slammed shut behind him with a final, unforgiving thud. Inside the car, the reality sank in. He was being taken away. Wrongfully, unfairly, unjustly. His heart pounded in his chest as he stared out the window at the fading light of the evening. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not to him. Not today. And yet, here he was. The squad car's door shut behind Marcus with a metallic thud that echoed inside his chest. The sound wasn't just noise. It was final, heavy, and suffocating, like the world had suddenly locked him away. The seat beneath him was cold and hard. The air inside the car smelled faintly of rubber and stale sweat. He sat there, hands cuffed, tightly behind his back, staring at the wire mesh that separated him from the officers in the front. He could still hear voices outside the murmurs of bystanders, the buzz of curiosity. A few people had their phones out, recording what was happening, their lenses like tiny eyes following every second. Marcus wondered if those videos would save him, or if they would disappear into the noise of social media. One story among many. Soon forgotten, the car jolted as it pulled away from the curb. The city lights began to blur past the window. Marcus pressed his forehead against the glass, his mind racing. He wanted to scream. He wanted to bang on the window and shout for help. But he stayed quiet, breathing slowly, trying to keep control of his emotions. He knew too well that one wrong move, one outburst, could be twisted into resisting arrest. Minutes felt like hours as they drove toward the police station. Inside, the officers said nothing. Not one explanation. Not one word of reason. Only the silence of authority, heavy and unshakable. Marcus felt like he had been swallowed whole by a system that didn't see him as a man, only as a suspect. When they finally arrived at the station, the fluorescent lights above the entrance glared down like harsh spotlights. The officers pulled him out of the car, their grip firm and unkind, as if they had truly caught a criminal. He stumbled slightly, the handcuffs making it difficult to balance. But no one offered to steady him. Inside the station, the atmosphere was no kinder. The place smelled of paper, ink, and sweat. Phones rang, radios buzzed, and the sound of footsteps echoed against the walls. Marcus was led past rows of desks where officers glanced up briefly, some with curiosity, others with indifference, as if seeing another black man in handcuffs was nothing out of the ordinary. They brought him to a small booking area. One officer removed his wallet and phone from his pockets, tossing them onto a counter without care. Another officer asked questions in a bored tone: his name, his address, his date of birth. Marcus answered, each word carrying the weight of disbelief. He wanted to shout, "Why am I here? What did I do?" But each time he opened his mouth, the officer's cold eyes reminded him they didn't care. Then came the mugshot. A camera flashed, capturing his face in that moment of humiliation. Marcus stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with both anger and shame. He thought of how wrong it was, an image of him labeled as a criminal when he had done nothing. That picture, he feared, would live in some file forever, a lie frozen in time. After the photo, he was led to a holding cell. The heavy metal door screeched as it opened, and with a shove, Marcus was inside. The door clanged shut behind him with a finality that sent a chill down his spine. The cell was small, with concrete walls that seemed to close in on him. A steel bench stretched along one side, and the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and despair. He sat down slowly, his wrists aching from the cuffs that had only just been removed. For the first time since the ordeal began, Marcus was alone. And that was when the weight of it all truly hit him. He buried his face in his hands, trying to steady his breathing. He thought about his children, who were probably wondering where he was. He thought about his wife, pacing near the window, checking her phone, her worry growing with each passing minute. Marcus felt anger boiling inside him, but also fear. Fear that he might be stuck here for hours or even days. Fear that this wrongful arrest could follow him forever, staining his name, his career, his future. The thought made his stomach twist. He closed his eyes, trying to find some strength within himself. He had done nothing wrong. He knew that. But here, within these walls, his innocence didn't seem to matter. What mattered was power, who had it, and who didn't. And Marcus knew he was on the losing side of that equation. The sound of keys jingling outside the cell broke his thoughts. An officer walked by without looking at him, the echo of his boots filling the hallway. Marcus sat in silence, staring at the floor, feeling the hours stretch painfully long. He replayed the arrest over and over in his head, searching for answers, searching for logic. But there was none. It was all built on suspicion, on prejudice, on the color of his skin. And then, in the midst of his despair, a small flicker of determination lit inside him. They had given him one phone call. That would be his chance. His one chance to fight back against this injustice. Marcus lifted his head, his eyes sharper now. He wasn't just a man in a cell. It was a man with a brother, whose voice carried weight, whose authority stretched further than the walls of this police station. And soon, that one call would change everything. Marcus sat on the cold steel bench of the holding cell, his back against the unforgiving concrete wall. The room was small, suffocating, and smelled of dampness mixed with disinfectant. The buzzing fluorescent light above flickered every few seconds, casting uneasy shadows that made the cell feel like something out of a nightmare. The quiet was heavy, broken only by the occasional clank of keys or the muffled voices of officers. Outside, he tried to steady his breathing, but his chest felt tight, like a heavy weight had been dropped onto it. His wrists still burned from the handcuffs, the marks on his skin a reminder of the humiliation he had just endured. He rubbed them gently, but the sting wasn't only physical, it was emotional, spiritual. Every part of him screamed that this was wrong, that he shouldn't be here. Yet here he was. The fear began to creep in slowly, like water seeping through cracks in a wall. At first, it was just a whisper in his mind. What if they don't let me out? But the whisper grew louder, turning into a storm of terrifying possibilities. What if they decided to charge him with something he hadn't done? What if this arrest became a permanent stain on his record? What if his children grew up remembering their father as a man in handcuffs? Not because he was guilty, but because he was black in the wrong place at the wrong time. His thoughts spun out of control, each one darker than the last. He pictured his wife pacing the living room, glancing at the clock, calling his phone over and over, wondering why he hadn't come home. He imagined his kids sitting at the dinner table, their plates of food untouched, their eyes wide with worry. The thought pierced him deeper than the handcuffs ever could. He pressed his palms against his eyes, trying to block out the images, but they kept coming. He thought of the news headlines he had read before, the countless names of men who looked like him. Men who had been wrongfully arrested, some who had been beaten, some who never made it home. Their stories flashed through his mind, each one whispering, "This could be you. This could be your end." Marcus had always believed in fairness. He had grown up being taught to respect the law, to trust in justice. He had even told his children that police officers were there to protect people. But sitting in that cell, stripped of his freedom and his dignity, that belief began to crumble. For the first time, he truly felt how fragile justice could be when the people in power refused to see him as human. The helplessness was the hardest part. He wasn't in control of his own life anymore. Every decision was in the hands of people who didn't care about his innocence. He wanted to stand up, to fight, to shout his truth at the top of his lungs, but what good would it do? In here, his voice was just another sound bouncing off the concrete walls. He looked at the steel bars in front of him, their cold, hard lines cutting him off from the outside world. Beyond them, life went on. Officers laughed at jokes. Phones rang, paperwork shuffled, but for Marcus, time had frozen. He felt like he had been buried alive, unseen and unheard. The minutes dragged on like hours. He tried to pray, whispering under his breath for strength, for protection, for a way out. His voice trembled as he asked God to watch over his family, to keep them safe, to give him the courage not to break under the weight of this nightmare. But even as he prayed, the fear clung to him, wrapping tighter and tighter like chains. Then came the anger. It surged suddenly, hot and sharp, breaking through his fear. Why was this happening to him? Why was his skin color enough to turn him into a suspect? Why did the officers refuse to see his humanity? The questions burned inside him, but the anger only made the helplessness worse. He had no outlet, no way to fight back. He was trapped. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he blinked them away quickly. He didn't want to give them that victory. He didn't want to be broken, even if inside he felt like shattering into pieces. He clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms, grounding himself in the only strength he had left, the strength not to give in. It was then, in that moment of despair, that he remembered the lifeline. He still had the phone call. They hadn't given it to him yet, but he knew it was coming. That one call was the only thread connecting him back to his freedom, to his family, to his life. And Marcus knew exactly who he would call. The thought of his brother, the U.S. Attorney General, gave him a flicker of hope. A flicker was all he had, but it was enough to keep him breathing, enough to keep him from drowning in the fear and helplessness that threatened to consume him. He sat up straighter, wiped his face, and took a slow, deep breath. Yes, he was afraid. Yes, he felt powerless. But the story wasn't over yet. And when that phone call came, everything would change. Marcus sat in the holding cell, his back pressed against the cold wall, trying to keep himself calm. Time moved painfully, slow. Every tick of the clock sounded like thunder in his ears. The fear still lingered in his chest, but beneath it was something else now: determination. He had waited long enough. At last, the officer appeared at the bars and unlocked the door. "You get one call," the officer said flatly, as though he were doing Marcus a favor instead of following the law. Marcus stood up slowly, his legs stiff. from sitting too long. The officer guided him down the hallway, past desks cluttered with papers, past bulletin boards filled with mugshots. He felt dozens of eyes on him, some curious, others indifferent, a few openly judgmental. He kept his head high, even though the shame weighed heavy on him. They led him to a small desk phone in the corner of the room. The handset was old, scratched, the cord twisted like a snake. For many people, a single phone call might not mean much, but for Marcus, this was everything. This was the one chance to break free from the nightmare that had swallowed him whole. The officer handed him the receiver. "Make it quick." Marcus nodded, though his hands trembled as he picked up the phone. He dialed carefully, each number pressed with steady fingers. He knew this number by heart. He had called it countless times before, though never like this, never with his freedom on the line. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. His heart pounded harder with each ring. What if his brother didn't answer? What if he was in a meeting? What if he didn't hear the phone? Panic clawed at Marcus's chest, but then, hello? The voice was calm, authoritative, familiar. Relief washed over Marcus like a flood. His brother had answered. "It's me," Marcus said quickly, his voice low, urgent. "I've been arrested." There was a pause on the other end. Arrested. For what? Marcus closed his eyes. For nothing. They pulled me over, said I fit some description. They put me in cuffs, brought me in. I didn't do anything. You know I didn't. His brother's voice changed instantly, sharp as steel. The U.S. Attorney General was not just a title, it was power, authority, respect. "Which station are you at?" Marcus gave him the address. His voice shook as he spoke, but with every word, he felt a little stronger. His brother's presence, even through the phone, was like a shield wrapping around him. "Listen to me," his brother said firmly. "Stay calm. Don't argue with anyone. I'll handle this." Those words, "I'll handle this," hit Marcus like a lifeline. For the first time since the nightmare began, he felt a flicker of safety. Of hope. The officer standing nearby tapped his watch impatiently. "Wrap it up," he said. Marcus nodded quickly. "Thank you," he whispered into the phone. "Please. Hurry. I'm on my way," his brother replied, his voice steady, unshakable. "You won't spend another hour in there." Marcus hung up the phone, his hands still trembling, but this time it wasn't just fear. It was adrenaline. He turned slightly, meeting the officer's gaze. For the first time that night, he didn't feel powerless. The officer sneered. "Who'd you call?" "Your lawyer?" Marcus said nothing. He didn't have to. Inside, he carried the knowledge of who his brother was, of what that name carried in rooms like this one. A storm was coming, and the officers had no idea they had just arrested the brother of one of the most powerful legal figures in the country. Back in his cell, Marcus sat straighter. He was still behind bars, but his spirit no longer felt chained. His brother would come, and when he did, the walls of this place would shake. Minutes ticked by. Each one stretched like an eternity, but Marcus clung to his hope. Outside, life in the station went on as usual, all officers chatting, phones ringing, but a subtle shift had begun. The officer who had overheard his call whispered something to another, and soon there were glances, murmurs, uneasy shuffles of feet. Word was spreading. Marcus leaned his head back against the wall, closing his eyes. He thought about his family again, about how he would soon be walking through the front door, hugging his children tightly, telling them Daddy was home. The thought gave him strength. For the first time that night, he allowed himself a small smile. The fear was still there. Yes, but it was no longer stronger than the hope. Because one call had changed everything. The air inside the station began to change long before Marcus saw it. He felt it first, the uneasy tension creeping through the hallways, carried in whispers and side glances. For hours, the officers had treated him like he was invisible, like he was just another nameless suspect to push through the system. But now, something was different. Something had cracked. The officer who had stood over Marcus during his phone call returned to the desk, muttering something to a colleague. At first, it was casual, almost dismissive. But then Marcus saw the man's expression change, a brows lifting, eyes widening slightly, lips tightening into a thin line. He leaned closer to his partner, whispering again, this time with urgency. Soon, 2 more officers joined the conversation. Heads bent together, words exchanged quickly, faces growing pale. Marcus watched all of this from his cell, his heart pounding. He couldn't hear exactly what was being said, but he didn't need to. He knew his brother's name. He knew the kind of weight it carried. And by the way, the room suddenly felt less certain. He knew the officers were beginning to realize it, too. The shift became even clearer a few minutes later. The same officer who had barked orders at Marcus earlier now avoided looking directly at him. His footsteps weren't heavy with authority anymore. They were lighter, more cautious, as though each step needed to be measured. Another officer, who had once sneered at him while writing notes, now kept glancing nervously toward the holding cell. Like Marcus wasn't just some man in cuffs anymore, but a problem that could explode at any moment. Phones began to ring more. Often one officer picked up, nodded quickly, and said, "Yes, sir, understood." His tone was suddenly respectful, almost anxious, so unlike the dismissive arrogance Marcus had seen before. He hung up and whispered to his supervisor, who immediately stood, straightened his uniform, and left the room in a hurry. Marcus's pulse quickened. He didn't know who was on the other end of those calls, but he had a good guess. His brother was already pulling strings, already shaking the ground beneath the station. And the tremors were spreading fast. Minutes later, the door to the station swung open with force. A tall man in a dark suit entered, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the floor. He wasn't in uniform, but the authority in his presence was undeniable. Every officer in the room straightened instinctively. Marcus didn't recognize him, but he knew this man was important, someone sent to assess the situation. Someone who already knew who Marcus's brother was. The suited man spoke quietly with the desk sergeant, and Marcus noticed how the sergeant's face changed color. Red first, then pale. He kept nodding, his mouth tight, sweat beginning to form at his temples. When the conversation ended, the suited man glanced toward the holding cell. His eyes lingered on Marcus, not with suspicion, but with something closer to apology. Back in the cell, Marcus sat taller. For hours, he had been treated like he was nothing, stripped of dignity, swallowed by fear. But now, the balance was shifting. He could feel it. The same men who had barked at him, shoved him, humiliated him, were losing their grip. Power was sliding from their hands, and they knew it. 2 officers finally approached the cell. The one holding the keys hesitated before unlocking the door. His earlier arrogance was gone. His voice wavered slightly as he said, "You'll be released shortly." Marcus stared at him, his face calm, but his eyes sharp. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. His silence spoke louder than words. It reminded them that this wasn't mercy, this was justice, coming for them whether they liked it or not. As they escorted him out, the hallway felt different. No more mocking smirks, no more dismissive looks. Now it was all silence and nervous glances. Some officers avoided eye contact entirely, pretending to be busy with paperwork. Others looked at him with an unease that bordered on fear. The name of his brother had spread through the building like fire, burning away their confidence. By the time Marcus reached the release desk, the sergeant himself was waiting. His tone was stiff, professional, forced into politeness. "There seems to have been a mistake," he said, avoiding Marcus's gaze. "You're free to go." Marcus almost laughed at the word mistake. That single word was their attempt to sweep away the hours of humiliation, the fear, the wrongful arrest. A mistake. No, this wasn't a mistake. This was abuse. This was injustice. And they knew it. But Marcus didn't argue. He didn't shout or demand apologies. He simply stood there, tall and silent, his presence alone reminding them of the storm that had been unleashed. He knew his brother's involvement wasn't finished. The real reckoning was still coming. As the cuffs were finally removed from his wrists, Marcus rubbed the red marks left behind. They stung, but they also reminded him of what he had survived. He looked one last time around the station, memorizing the faces of the men who had thought they could take away his freedom without consequence. And though no words were spoken, the message was clear. Everything had changed. Marcus stepped out of the station doors, the night air rushing against his skin like a wave of freedom. But it wasn't sweet relief that filled his chest, it was a storm. His wrists still bore the deep red marks from the cuffs, his body still heavy with the weight of humiliation, and his mind still replayed every second of the injustice he had endured. He paused just outside, taking in the sight of the flashing streetlights and the small group of bystanders still gathered across the street. Many of them had their phones out, recording, whispering, pointing. A few recognized him from earlier when he was shoved into the squad car. Now they watched as he walked out, no longer in chains. Their curiosity turned into murmurs of shock. They let him go. Why? What happened? Marcus didn't answer their questions. He simply walked forward, his shoulders squared, his eyes unyielding. He wasn't free because they admitted their mistake. He was free because his brother's name carried power that they couldn't ignore. And soon, that truth would spread far beyond this street. Inside the station, the whispers hadn't stopped. Officers were tense, their voices low, their glances nervous. The name of Marcus's brother, the U.S. Attorney General, hung in the air like thunderclouds. They knew what was coming. An investigation, a spotlight. Questions they couldn't avoid by morning. The story had already broken. A short video, shaky but clear, appeared online, first captured by a bystander who had recorded Marcus's arrest from the moment. The officers forced him onto the hood of his car. The video spread like wildfire. Within hours, hashtags trended across social media. Hashtag wrongfully arrested, hashtag justice for Marcus, hashtag police brutality. The comments poured in. Anger, disbelief, outrage. People recognized his face. They recognized his innocence. And when someone revealed who his brother was, the story exploded into national headlines. Brother of U.S. Attorney General wrongfully arrested by police. The headline flashed across news networks, dominating morning broadcasts. Anchors spoke with urgency, their voices filled with disbelief. Reporters replayed the video again and again, pausing on the moment Marcus was handcuffed. The officers' harsh voices audible over his calm protests. Experts weighed in, condemning the misuse of authority. Calling it yet another example of racial profiling, Marcus watched it all from his living room. His family gathered tightly around him. His wife sat close, holding his hand as though afraid he might be taken again. His children leaned against him, their eyes wide, their innocence bruised by what they had witnessed. He felt both rage and sorrow as he saw his own face on the screen, his dignity stripped bare for the world to analyze. But he also felt something else, a fire. The truth was no longer buried in a police file. It was out in the open. Meanwhile, at press conferences across the country, journalists bombarded officials with questions. How could this happen? How could the brother of the U.S. Attorney General be treated this way? And if it can happen to him, how many others has it happened to people without powerful connections? People whose stories never make the news. The Attorney General himself spoke publicly. His words were measured but sharp, carrying the weight of authority and anger. No citizen should ever be treated the way my brother was treated. His wrongful arrest is not just a personal injustice, it is a reflection of systemic failures in our policing system. This will not be ignored. This will be investigated. The nation listened. Communities rallied. Protesters gathered in front of the very police station where Marcus had been held, holding signs that read "Justice for Marcus" and "End racial profiling." Their chants filled the air, demanding accountability. Inside, Marcus felt torn. He hadn't asked to become a symbol. He hadn't asked for his pain to become a headline. But as he watched strangers across the country fight for justice in his name, he realized his story wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every man, woman, and child who had been silenced, mistreated, or wrongfully accused because of the color of their skin. The truth was no longer hidden. It had been unveiled for the world to see. And once the truth is exposed, it cannot be erased. The days that followed Marcus's release were unlike anything he had ever experienced. His life, once ordinary and quiet, had been thrust into the public eye. Reporters camped outside his home, microphones thrust forward every time he stepped outside. News vans lined the street. Neighbors whispered in disbelief, some offering hugs of support, others avoiding eye contact as if unsure how to face the man who had become the center of a national storm. Inside his home, Marcus tried to hold on to normalcy. He sat at the kitchen table with his children, listening to their stories about school, helping them with homework. But even in those small, familiar moments, the weight of what had happened clung to him. He caught his children staring at his wrists, their young eyes lingering on the faint red marks left by the handcuffs. They didn't ask about them directly, but the questions lingered in their silence. His wife tried to shield him from the chaos outside, but Marcus could see the worry etched into her face. She had watched him walk out of that station alive, but she knew it could have ended differently. Too many stories had ended differently. The fear still lingered in her eyes every time he left the house. But Marcus was no longer just a husband, father, or brother. He had become something else's symbol. His story wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of authority. Everyone who had ever been silenced or wrongfully accused. The Attorney General, his brother, wasted no time. He launched a full investigation into the arrest, demanding accountability from the department. Public hearings were announced. Officers were called to testify. And with every revelation, the truth became harder to deny. Marcus's arrest hadn't been an isolated mistake. It was part of a larger systemic problem that stretched far beyond one man, one station, or one night. Nationwide, the response was overwhelming. Civil rights groups organized rallies, marching through city streets with Marcus's name on banners. Social media campaigns spread his story across the globe, voices rising in unison. If this could happen to the brother of the U.S. Attorney General, imagine how many nameless men are suffering the same fate in silence. For Marcus, the attention was overwhelming. He hadn't asked to become a movement. Yet, as he stood before crowds and cameras, telling his story in his own words, he realized the power of his voice. His trembling hands steadied as he spoke of fear, humiliation, and injustice. He wasn't just speaking for himself anymore, he was speaking for millions. The officers involved faced disciplinary action. Some were suspended, others removed from duty pending investigation. Their names, once anonymous behind uniforms, were now dragged into the light. They were no longer just enforcers of the law, they were symbols of everything broken within it. But Marcus wasn't interested in revenge. His eyes were set on something greater. Change. "This isn't about me alone," he said during a press conference, his voice steady despite the cameras flashing in his face. This is about making sure no other man, no other woman, no other child has to feel the fear I felt. This is about building a system that serves justice, not prejudice. Those words struck deep. They were replayed across news stations, quoted in newspapers, echoed on social media. They carried a truth too powerful to ignore. Slowly, reforms began. Police departments across the country revisited their training protocols. New measures for accountability were discussed in city councils and state legislatures. The Attorney General himself pushed for broader reforms at the federal level. The incident that had started with flashing lights on a quiet street had grown into a catalyst for nationwide debate and action. And yet, even as the world around him shifted, Marcus remained grounded in who he was. He still rose early, still tucked his children into bed, still kissed his wife goodnight. But something inside him had changed forever. The fear hadn't disappeared completely, it lingered. Like a scar, but it had been replaced with something stronger, purpose. Late one evening, long after the media had left for the night and the house was quiet, Marcus stood by the window, staring out at the street. The night air was still calm, so different from the night that had changed his life. He thought about how close he had come to being just another forgotten name, another statistic. But instead, his story had been heard. He whispered to himself, almost like a promise, "This won't be wasted. My pain will mean something." And with that, Marcus turned away from the window, ready to face whatever came next. Because his fight was no longer just about survival. It was about justice for himself, for his family, and for every voice that had been silenced before his. The nightmare had begun with flashing lights. But it ended with something brighter. A call for change that could no longer be ignored.